Afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay? I'll try to talk at this volume. Thank you for coming to listen to this, and I guess I have to click here. The best talks have a clearly defined premise and a nice tight conclusion and some good analytics and pictures in between. This is not one of those. What we have is a data set, and we wanted to see what was in there and compare it to conventional wisdom. So the goals for this, it's not to test one thing, but we're going to show you a range of things. And my hope is that after the talk, you'll come and say, you know, that didn't look right because it doesn't agree with my intuition on how the market works. And that'll be great because then we'll go explore it in more detail. But I'll show you what we've done so far. We specifically wanted to test I think a different framework than what has been used in analyzing wine prices. It is something that we've used elsewhere. I'm a physicist by training. I actually make a living doing data science and a lot of consumer modeling. And we're going to be using Age-Period-Cohort models, which don't come from consumer modeling, but we used a lot for things like modeling the mortgage crisis, that sort of thing. In this analysis, we have a database that's about 1.5 million auction prices from 12 different auction houses spanning about 12 years. For the slides that we'll show here, we focused on Bordeaux and Burgundy. But at the end, I'll show you what's going on today in the markets, and we'll toss out some other segments. The prices are not adjusted for inflation, but they are adjusted for the exchange rate at the time so that everything's in dollars, because we have auctions that are happening in London or Switzerland or Hong Kong, and we need one common denominator. We only looked at homogeneous lots. If it's a lot that includes different wines, we're not going to try to apportion the price among those things. We just filtered down to homogeneous lots. And we did a price analysis, not shown here, but on the bottle size, and found that the market's very efficient when it comes to bottle size. So we just normalized everything to a 750 milliliter bottle. Age-period cohort models. This is the only formula we'll show. And the idea is that we want it to be simple, but we're modeling the log of the price, and we're saying initially three things: that there should be a life cycle versus the age of the wine, a quality relative to the vintage of the wine, and a market environment. Now we'll actually do some analysis later where we dive into both the quality and the environment, but initially what we're doing is called a decomposition algorithm. So where we take the data, this is a graph of some vintages. The analysis is actually at the lot level. It's not aggregated into vintages, but for visualization, just to show you a graph of some of the vintages we analyzed. The algorithm splits that into these three parts. So from this data, the first thing you would get is a life cycle. And I realize the graphs here are kind of eye charts. We've got a paper we're happy to give you so that you can actually read the axes. But the x-axis here is about 70 years. We don't have 70 years of data. What we have is 12 years of data of wines of many different ages. And one of the nice things this algorithm does is to normalize those things so that we get one age function out. And that's, in the end, when if you want to do some forecasting with something like this, you'd say, well, I have a wine that's 15 years old. What do I think it'll be in 20 or 30 or so forth? So potentially this would give you long-term forecasting capability. But of course, other things come into play. One is the environment. This graph is the so-called Lafite Bubble, which is well understood. The Chinese came in 2010 and bought a whole lot of Bordeaux wines. So that stands out. You can see the changes since then. But right now, I should point out, all of this analysis is, for those who like statistics, we're doing fixed effects. These are dummy variables. There's no explanation given other than the words I'm offering, right? So each point along the life cycle, each point along the environment, and the third graph here, each point in vintage is not explained. We're just saying, here are the numbers that come out. And then we'll go through some graphs where we try to explain it. So right now, we've got life cycle with age, environment versus time, which is really your market index. This would be something you'd compare to the LiveX index. Created differently, I could talk about that another time. And then the vintage graph here, again, we're talking about price, and the vintage graph is the number you need to scale that life cycle to match the prices we're seeing in the certain environment that you're in. And so certain vintages obviously stand out here. And if you consider the confidence intervals on here, you're going to say that 2000, 2009, 2010 are all roughly equivalent on this graph. Obviously, we'll be adding more data and interested to see where 2009 and 2010 go, because we're looking for where will they be in decades to come. Now, these three graphs, statistically, what's important about this is that they're independent. So when we talk about vintages here, we've normalized for the fact that older vintages, we measured prices through the Lafite bubble. Newer vintages, of course, we haven't. And so different environments, but by measuring the environment and separating it out, we put them on an equal footing. So this vintage graph is really an apples-to-apples comparison regardless of the age or regardless of the environment, the market environment that we measured them through. So that's what adds value. Then the life cycles, that I showed you an example of one life cycle. Here's three. Lafite, Bordeaux excluding Lafite. We split out Lafite just because there's so much data, right? At this point, we did our segmentation just based on the amount of data we had. And there's such a story behind the Lafite bubble, we wanted to separate that. But Bordeaux, everything except Lafite. Burgundy is on here. You can see in Burgundy that the data is thinning out around year 28 through the end. The confidence intervals get much wider. So really, even though it looks like it may be sagging, it's not really any different from the others. This is a log linear scale, and it's showing kind of linearity versus log price, which would give you that rolling over effect you saw on the previous slide. Now, what is interesting in here, if you study these, is that those first 5, 8 years, these are at least flat in prices and maybe even declining a bit. And we've looked at all the different segments that we have data for. It seems they always decline a bit. But around year 5 or 8, then they start to take off for whatever appreciation they're going to have. So Sisi is going to talk about analysis. Oh, sorry, one more slide. But I already mentioned the vintage slide, so I'm going to skip ahead to save time. This is where we start looking for explanations. So Sisi's going to talk about explaining the environment functions that we were just looking at.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the correlations between the wine market and the stock market. And a good example would be, just as what he said, is the Lafite bubble. And so we all know the story. The Chinese suddenly had this craze about Lafite several years ago, and they drove up the demand. And so as a result, the Lafite price rose enormously during that time. And then when their interest faded, their price dropped as hard as they rose. And this graph shows the Lafite index in comparison with the Shanghai stock market. And we chose the Shanghai stock market because it's a good representation of the Chinese wealth. And then here, in the second graph, we can see this is the Bordeaux market index in general in the past decade in comparison to the Hong Kong stock market. And this is the Bordeaux without Lafite. And we separated the Lafite because we wanted to see if it was an isolated event, and we found that it wasn't. You can see here, I don't know if I can point. In the 2010-2011 period, there was this huge rise in the Hong Kong stock market, and we can see the effect of Lafite during that period. And we can see that how the Lafite effect was spilling over to the rest of Bordeaux. So with that, I'll turn over to
Sisi has a lot more analysis on other segments and other comparisons, so I'm sure she'll be happy to go through that. Then we looked at what was called the vintage effect before. Of course, there are many talks about how do you explain good vintages and weaker vintages. So what we've done here is take the vintage quality measure that we have, that price scaling measure that's been cleaned of the market and cleaned of the age, and that's a good thing to compare against things like ratings. So on here, we've got Bordeaux on the left, Burgundy on the right, and we're showing Wine Advocate, Wine Spectator and Wine Advocate. And you can see, I heard another talk yesterday where they were saying that you get a nice scaling between about 90 and 100 points, and prior to that, it's pretty much flat. And we see the same thing here. You get some interesting behavior right around 99 and 100. I'd be curious to talk to people more about what they think might drive that. And then we did another analysis where we looked at auction houses. Fascinating to see where the same bottle hypothetically could sell at very different prices at different auction houses. They, of course, would say, if you're one of those premier auction houses, they'd say they are careful about verifying the provenance of the wine and all these other things. In fact, we find a price range on here for Bordeaux of something like plus or minus 20%, for Burgundy plus or minus 40%, and those are correlated, so you get high prices in the same places. Again, this is all cleaned of the market. That's the thing I keep repeating because that's what makes these graphs a little different than what you've seen before, is that we've normalized away effects of age and market environment. So to give you one last snapshot, we got this analysis ready last summer, and all the charts we had for the environment, these are our market indices, they were all plunging. The market was still falling through early last year. We did a refresh, and what you see is that middle last summer, if you bought, it looks like that's about the best time you're going to buy. If there are cycles in wine prices, that was definitely a low point. And Lafite, Bordeaux, ex-Lafite, Burgundy, Italy and Germany, all of these have been trending up since last summer. Unfortunately for California and Australia, we haven't seen that turn yet. Those are still going down. So we'll finish here, and happy to talk to people later if you want to educate us on what our results show. Thanks.